Pull up a chair and buckle up. It's the Original Strength BodCast. Hey guys, thanks so much for tuning in to this week's edition of the Original Strength BodCast. I have a very special show this week. I am talking with Jo Belton, who is a pain patient advocate. And Jo is going to be talking to us about navigating the waters of pain and chronic pain. Jo, thank you so much for being on the show this week.
Thanks so much for having me, Tim. I appreciate it.
Jo, everybody has a origin story, and I think yours is pretty big. Do you mind sharing that with us to give us some background on how you became a pain patient advocate?
Sure. It's probably a little bit long, but I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. But I want to share that background and that origin because it provides context for how I kind of changed my understanding of pain and how that helped me to move forward and why I do this work now. So growing up, I'm going all the way back. I was a lifelong athlete. Like I knew how to throw a football before I could do anything else. My dad had wanted a boy, so I was very much a tomboy. And I played all the sports growing up and was very competitive. And prided myself in that competitive nature and spirit and being a really good athlete at my high school. And then I didn't play sports in college, but I played on a women's travel team, over 18 travel fast pitch softball team, which was a really competitive league. And we got to travel all over the Midwest and play games. And that was pretty cool. And all of that, like being a tomboy, being a competitive athlete, was kind of what led me into a career in firefighting as well. Like I got all the education one could want. I even went to graduate school in neuroscience.
Wow.
And I left that program to move to California and pay out-of-state tuition at community college to go to fire tech classes.
Wait a minute. You got a degree in neuroscience.
I left early, but I was in a PhD program at the Ohio State University.
A PhD
really
program.
Well. Yeah.
And you decided to put water on fire.
Yep, and that was pretty much my advisor's reaction too.
All right.
I was doing really well in my coursework and in my research, so he really did not understand why anyone would make that decision. But I grew up in Detroit, so very blue collar. I grew up with great uncles who were in the Detroit Fire Service, and I always wanted to be a firefighter. Perhaps a little bit unsafely when I would be up at my cousin's grandparents' house. We'd go snowmobiling, and I would wear my uncle's fire helmet as my snowmobiling helmet, which would probably not do much in a snowmobiling crash. And that was when I was a kid, like 8, 9, 10 years old. So it was something I always wanted to do. I was absolutely forbidden to do it by my uncles. At that time, the Detroit Fire Service, this was like in the 90s when I was in high school, was really underfunded and they were on strike a lot and they didn't have working equipment. So it just wasn't a good profession to get into at that time, and was very male dominated. It still is, but I think they just had a lot of worries about me. But so then I went to college. I did all that, did really well in school, went to graduate school at Ohio State. In neuroscience, and lost my mind because, like I said, I was an athlete before all this, and I've been camping since I was 3 months old. My mom took me on my first camping trip when I was 3 months old. So I loved the outdoors and I loved being active, and I was working in a research lab in a basement with blacked out windows, and I never saw the sun, and it just, so much of it was very not me. Like I loved the learning part of it, and I didn't love doing the research as much, but I loved the learning part of it. But the environment was not suited for my personality, who was very much an active person who likes to be outdoors. And when I told my advisor that I was leaving that program, I joined 2 softball teams, 2 male I was in a male league. For both of them, because the co-ed leagues weren't competitive enough for me. So just to get back to that competitiveness, that I think part of that comes from growing up in the Detroit area too, where it's Detroit versus everybody, even now. So we kind of grow up with that mentality. And through all of that time of being an athlete, even into college when I was on the the women's team, the travel league, I had a lot of injuries during all of that time. I've broken my nose at least 4 times and had to have reconstructive surgery under anesthesia twice because it was just demolished, which was very devastating. The first time I was 13, so a very difficult time to have your face demolished by a broken nose. Broke it in softball. So broke 3 times, broken in sports. Once was a dancing accident that I won't go into. I was hit by a car, had a compound fib fracture, so I had surgery for that. And I had all sorts of like sprains and strains and just the common injuries that come with playing sports for every season throughout the year. And I always recovered well from those injuries, and those surgeries never had pain problems at all during any of those injuries. I played in an entire softball game with a broken nose. I had to bunt every at bat because I couldn't see over my nose looking at the pitcher. So I had to be face on because my nose was so huge. And I was a first baseman, so you're always looking face on to everything anyway. So pain was never an issue for me. It was never a problem. And I had all these notions of what pain was through those experiences. And then becoming a firefighter, going through an academy, which, as you know, you probably went through an academy as well. They're freaking painful on every level, like physically, mentally. They can be very draining, and I tore my rhomboid in my academy. I couldn't feel my left arm and still finished my academy. So I had been through all those experiences and had been, injured throughout those things too, just minor injuries and no issues. And then I was working as a firefighter and on a routine call, just a normal call. I worked outside of a retirement community called Leisure World on a paramedic engine. I was a firefighter paramedic. So we ran medical aids all the time. And this was a pretty involved advanced life support call. It was a full arrest in the middle of the night. And I was on radio that day, which meant I was doing all the paperwork and the one that was talking to the hospital in the back of the ambulance. And when we get to the hospital, you're still doing a lot of work on a full arrest. And you're there for a while as you transition that full arrest over to the ER staff. And when we got back on the engine about 1:30 in the morning, I had realized I'd left my clipboard on the counter in the ER. So I said, "Hey, Cap, I left my clipboard inside. I'm just going to go run and get it." And got off the fire engine pretty quickly because I was in a hurry. I wanted to get back to the station so my crew could get some sleep before our next call. And I missed the step and just went straight from the cab to the ground. So about a 3-foot drop, but it wasn't a big deal. Like I still landed upright and I just felt a twinge in my hip. And that was it, just a twinge. I still ran into the ER, ran back to the engine and went back to work and worked for another 2 weeks before I said, "Hey, Cap," or I did tell my captain that I felt that twinge because it was like driven into us in our academy. Report everything.
Yes, been there.
Yeah, report everything.
Paperwork.
So I had reported it to my captain, and then after 2 weeks, it wasn't getting better. So I said, like, "Cap, the hip twinge thing isn't getting better." So when I got off shift one day, I went to our occupational doctor. And that started me down an entirely unexpected path of ongoing pain that just got worse and that I didn't have very good explanations for, and that all of the treatments that were expected to fix it didn't. And all of my notions about what pain is and what causes pain and how to fix it were kind of thrown out the window. I had to live the experience to start to understand that experience differently. And there was a lot of cognitive dissonance there and a lot of unlearning and learning for me to do throughout that process because I had very distinct notions of what pain was. And they were very structural based, like injury based, tissue damage based notions, and then also biomechanical based notions. As we chatted in our emails together, I was a peer fitness trainer for my department. So I had taken all of the fitness classes. So you get a little bit of information and think you know a lot. At least I did. And And that included some ideas about pain and how to fix it. So my answer for everything was to lift heavier shit, you know? Like that was my answer for all things. And I was a heavy lifter at the time that I got injured. Um, and a runner and all of these things were part of my identity of being a firefighter, a really fit, strong person. I would brag about my 12 strict pull-ups that I could do and deadlifting more than twice my body weight and all of like hitting all of those benchmarks that show that you're strong kind of thing. And so I felt like a really strong, fit person. I was the strongest, fittest I had ever been in my life when this stupid twinge happened and set me on this unexpected path. But what was really interesting when I first went to physical therapy was where I went first. All of the explanations for my pain, which totally suited my biases and were what I believed, where that pain was due to instability, either hip instability or core instability, or it was due to weakness, that there was weakness somewhere that needed to be strengthened. And it was only in retrospect, after coming to those new understandings of pain, that I realized those explanations didn't really make sense for the person that I was at the time that all of this started.
Can I ask you a
Oh,
question?
yeah,
Or
absolutely.
maybe two or three. I am guessing with the injury, when you went for diagnostic tests and everything, they probably didn't find anything structural, or did they?
So at first, I was just diagnosed soft tissue, just a soft tissue strain, and then I got so it's kind of like contradictory. I was given muscle relaxants and then physical therapy to strengthen. So I had to relax my muscles and then strengthen them, and so did those two things. And in looking back, the protocol that my first physical therapist put me through, I don't really understand the rationale for, because I just did what I called PT triathlons. I'd go ride the bike for 15 minutes, run the treadmill for 15 minutes, do a stair mill for 15 minutes, and those were my sessions for those first like 4 or 5 weeks that I was in PT. And it's no wonder to me now, and looking back, that my pain got worse and not better, because what I probably needed was some time off. And I was still working full time. I was still working 24, 48, 72-hour shifts. Still working out when I was at work because no one told me not to. Still running on days off because no one told me not to. And this shows you kind of what an idiot I am too. And how
That's how we learn.
and so the rationale for it doesn't make sense to me in retrospect. But so it was just considered soft tissue at that time, and that strengthening and stability exercises were going to be the thing that rehabilitated it. But that didn't happen.
How does it, like, I used to always, because I always heard the same thing. Well, if you have an issue, it's because you're weak somewhere.
Right,
And I
right.
used to think, how am I weak? So, like,
Like, and for me, I had all of these postural notions too. I mean, I was so much about form and proper form, especially doing heavy lifting, where it is important to have proper form. But even as a firefighter, and I think some of the things that we teach firefighters mess them up instead of making them more robust and resilient in their work. Every firefighter I know thinks he's going to be broke off when he's retired. And I don't think it has to be that way, because our bodies, as you know, are incredibly adaptable and resilient and strong, just inherently. And they can often solve movement problems themselves without us overthinking it and trying to control it so much. Yet we try to make firefighters like lift with this proper technique and all of these things, which are impossible on the job. And then I think it feeds into this notion of, I'm going to get hurt because this patient who might be 300 pounds is between the toilet and the tub. There is no proper lifting technique that is going to help that person get up. And there's all kinds of situations that you're in where you have to lift heavy weight, but there is no proper form.
No, and they don't tell you that person is likely wet or slippery or naked. Right. There's nothing to grab hold of. There's Like
Right. There's
it's
no clothing to like
no,
leverage,
you've got to
and
figure it out on the fly.
right. And the thing is, I think we can, and I think that our bodies absolutely can, and that they're
Yes.
strong enough and smart enough to. But when we feed this idea there's only one right way to lift or one right way to do something, um, it can mess us up later down the line when we
Yes.
do have pain, because then I became super controlling over my movement and my posture. Like just sitting here, like now I can slouch and do things and not sit up. I can just move like a normal person. When I was in pain, it was like I was always rotating my hips forward, chest back, chin up. I was standing at attention, like in my academy, 24 hours a day, because that was good posture, good form. And I thought that that was going to help with my pain. And I was fed those ideas from people too, that I had to fix my posture. And I'm like, my posture has never been a problem before. Like, have you, and me being a little bit arrogant, have you seen me lift? Like,
Oh, I get it.
like,
I totally get it.
like my posture isn't the problem. But I became more and more controlling over my movement rather than letting my my body, my human organism sort of solve for movement problems. And then with pain too, you tend to become really tense and braced. And then that can be reinforced by people telling you that when you move, you have to tense and brace. Well, for a person who's already tense and braced, to be more tense and braced is not helpful for a lot of them. A lot of times we need to be able to relax into movement, not become more stiff into movement. So I had all these conflicting messages, all of these things that I believed, and all this nonsense that I told other people when I was a peer fitness trainer. Like all this stuff that I had told other people who were in pain. And I will admit, growing up in Detroit, in a very blue collar family where you were not in pain unless there was blood or bone showing. Um, Growing up as a competitive athlete who really strove to be the best athlete that I could be and wanted to dominate people, being a firefighter where, very physical profession, and being a woman and only being 5'6" and being relatively small for a firefighter, I had to constantly prove my strength and my fitness every single day at work. And I had to prove myself twice as much to get half the credit for things. And all of that were things that I thrived at. I was okay in that environment. It's why I was a part of that environment. Um, I wanted to be one of the guys, kind of thing, and prove that I was one of the guys. And I had all of these notions of pain being weakness, like you said, but not just like weakness of a body part, but like weakness of character, weakness of constitution. And I didn't want to be a weak person. I couldn't think of myself as a weak person. And I had all these very judgmental notions of people who had chronic pain or ongoing pain, that they just weren't doing enough to get themselves out of it. They weren't eating clean enough, moving right enough, doing the things that I did. And so I was so awesome and healthy and fit and strong. And then this pain experience for me flipped all of that upside down. Like, but wait, I was doing all of the right things, all of the things that I told people, if you just do these things, you would be fine. You wouldn't have all these issues. And then all of a sudden I was on the other side of it and I was like, God, you're such an ass. Like, like why did you say these things to people? So I have a lot of regrets on things that I said, but I mean, all we can do with those is do better moving forward
Yes.
with better explanations and knowing better.
Well, sometimes you just don't know
You don't
anything
know.
until you experience something.
Yeah.
And it can be pain, or it can be like, how many people see somebody that is overweight and they just have these ideas about that person's character, their work ethic, their desires, their ability to control, self-control, all this stuff. And yet none of that's all a story. None of
Right.
it's true.
Right.
And until you're in those shoes, you don't know jack squat half the time, or any
Yeah.
time, really.
Yeah. And it's I love that you said it's just a story, and it's a story we create about another person and not that person's story. And I think we don't do enough to hear from that person, from hear what their story is, hear how they're making sense of things, hear their understanding of where they're at and where they want to go. Because oftentimes what we want for somebody or what we think is best for somebody is not what they want for themselves or what they think is best for themselves. And that's okay because it's their life.
Yes.
And that maybe through conversation and dialogue and those sorts of things, we can come to a joint story that makes sense for both people who are working together in whatever capacity to move forward with. That makes the way that I like to frame it now is biological sense. Like it fits with the science and our understanding, particularly pain, since that's the world that I'm in. I mean, not that I'm in a world of pain right now, but I mean like the pain treatment, research, study world. But it also needs to make biographical sense for that person too. We can't just focus on like the science and the evidence and the research. We have to focus on the person in their life because they're the ones living in their bodies, in their lives, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day.
And your issues, and I'm sure you can tell about this. If you're in pain or if you are overweight or whatever your issue is that consumes you, then it consumes you. And it
Yes.
does become your world. And it paints everything that you experience or how you interpret everything.
Yeah.
How did that, like, how did you get through that?
So there's a great quote that speaks exactly to this by a MD philosopher guy named Drew Letter. So I believe he's an MD and a philosopher, but also experienced chronic pain. So he's got really unique insights into that experience. And he wrote a paper on the paradoxes of pain, which is a wonderful paper. But in it, he talks about how pain is like this malignant mist through which we experience the world. And it's just such a beautiful way of putting it because it's so true. It's like this mist is enshrouding you, and everything you see, everything you experience, everything you do is experienced within that mist. So it clouds what you see. It can become so dense and so thick that you can't see anything else. And then I think moving forward is kind of like that fog or that mist lifting. And then you can see a little bit more of the path forward, be present a little bit more in your life. Because like you said, it's all consuming. And for me, pain became the only thing that I could focus on. It was the only thought that I had throughout my day, and every decision I made, every movement I made, from the littlest thing, from sitting I couldn't sit for over 2 years, but from sitting to standing to how I slept. Like I was so controlling over how I tried to position my body when I slept. All of these things became very centered around pain, and every thought just was like pain, 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 like this neon flashing sign of pain. And I also still had those beliefs that pain has to be damaged. It has to mean that there's something wrong with the structures or the tissues. So that has to be found and that has to be fixed. And no one disavowed me of those beliefs for a really long time. So I went through physical therapy about 5.5 months into the twinge experience. And the pain experience was when I finally went off work on workers' compensation. So during that 5.5 months, the pain was getting worse. I was still working full time, my regular shifts, still going to PT. But I was starting to lose function, where I noticed when I was wearing turnouts, I could not lift my leg high enough to get onto the rig. I always had to lead with my left leg. And I realized during a training session, the station that I worked at, we always had rookies. So we did a lot of training. And we were doing a training session, and I was just in so much pain. And I was working overtime that day. And still, so not even just working my regular shifts, working overtime.
That's how you learn.
Said to my captain, like, I don't think it's safe for me to be here. Like, not just for myself, but for my crew, for the public. I can't do my job in the way that I'm supposed to be able to do my job, in the way that I expect myself to be able to do my job. And even though most of our calls were medical aids, what if we did get a big fire and I couldn't carry my partner out because my hip gave way, or I didn't have the ability to walk upstairs or something like that. So that was incredibly stressful. And then going off work on workers' compensation, for people who are in that system, my heart just goes out to them, because it's such a difficult system to be within, where you're doubted before you're believed. And you have to prove that you are in pain. And by having to do that, you're essentially having to prove your worth as a human being, that you're telling the truth, so it's such an adversarial system to be within, and then so difficult to get appointments and things like that. And I just felt abandoned for a while, because I didn't have any care for about 4 months while my case was being reviewed and I was off work. And then I saw an ortho and I got injections, and the injections didn't work. And then I saw a surgeon, and I got my first diagnosis with the surgeon. And that was about 10 months into my experience, 11 months into my experience. And he diagnosed me with femoral acetabular impingement and recommended surgery. And that went through 3 months of review. So I had surgery about 13 and a half months after the first twinge for FAI. And I had high hopes that the surgery was going to fix me, and it didn't. But it did resolve some of the most like visceral, deep, nauseating pain that I had, that felt like there was like gremlins squeezing my internal organs, and
Wow.
it would make me nauseated. And that was the most distressing pain, but I still had pain in like a C pattern on my hip and growing pain after my surgery. So then that meant to me that I had to have messed up my surgery, that I had to have done something wrong after my weeks or months of PT. And I was still in pain. I had to have done something wrong to mess up my surgery, because I had those beliefs that pain has to equal damage and those sorts of things. During all of this time too, and it was really interesting that you brought up like the overweight and obese thing too. One of my fears was getting fat and losing my fitness, because that was something I had prided myself in. I was arrogant. I prided myself in intimidating people at the gym. I wanted to outlift guys at a station I had never worked at before. Like, my goal would be to outlift them. And so for me to then, when I was off work and I was no longer allowed to do things according to workers' compensation, I was so afraid of losing all of that and just getting fat and soft. And in all of those societal narratives that we have about how bad that is, all these judgments that we have around that became a part of those fears. So I became super controlling over what I ate, like super obsessively controlling over what I ate, measuring everything. Ate a ton, but like as clean as possible, and measured everything. And I lost almost 30 pounds between July, when I went off work on work comp, and my surgery in March the following year. So I didn't even look like myself anymore when I had that surgery. When I looked in the mirror, I saw a small, frail person that was not what I had been my whole life, who always prided myself in being strong and fit. Like, in my medical paperwork, it says pleasant, thin female, and nothing could have pissed me off more. Like, I'm not freaking pleasant. I'm from Detroit, and I am not thin. I'm strong and fit, and I have guns. Like, this is not who I am. This is not the person that I want to be. So all of that context, being away from the station, and where I had been used to being at the station more than being at home. I was used to being with my crew more than being with my husband. I was a wildland EMT, so would go out on wildland fires where I could be gone for weeks at a time. I was very much, fire all the time. That was my life. That was we call it a fire family for a reason. And then all of a sudden I wasn't there anymore. Wasn't at the station anymore. I wasn't with my crew anymore. And my crew didn't experience the same loss because there was just an overtime firefighter or another person assigned to that station. So they were always a whole crew. Like, I was the only one that was missing everybody, that didn't have that crew anymore. And then all of those things, like the not being able to do the things that made me feel like myself, like running and lifting and all of those things when I went off work. And not being able to do the things that make you feel like yourself, that's very distressing too. Being away from work was really distressing. Being away from my family was really distressing. Not being able to do the things that made me feel like myself just made me feel so lost and confused, and like I was living in this chaos, and I couldn't sit. That was my worst activity. So that meant I couldn't drive, and not being able to drive meant, not being able to go anywhere, not being able to leave my house. Even being a passenger in a car was really painful for me. So that meant no meeting a friend for coffee or a drink, no going out to dinner with my husband. I couldn't even watch movies on the couch because our couch was too soft. Like, I had to lie completely flat on the floor and wear these prism glasses that like changed the angle of the view so that I could still see the TV. And I would lie on the floor underneath our coffee table with these prism glasses on watching TV. Like,
Wow.
that was in my world became our house, and I never left. And like, in flexing my hip at all was really painful. So I would either be lying on the ground or standing at our kitchen counter. Like, those were the two places that I existed during this time. And all of that context plays a role in how we're experiencing our pain. Like, it's not a threat to our tissues so much as a threat to our existence and way of being in the world. And all of that, like, pain is very contextual in that there's biological factors that are involved, psychological factors that are involved, social, environmental factors that are involved, including those narratives that we're surrounded by about pain, about what it means to be fit and strong and healthy and all of those sorts of things. And then what it means not to be those things and those judgments that we might associate with those things. All of that become a part of our experience and feed into it. But I didn't learn any of that until a couple of years after my surgery. So I had surgery. It was determined I wasn't going to go back to being a firefighter. So I went into a civilian position. I worked light duty for a while. And then I became our wellness and fitness coordinator. But it was a struggle because I had to commute into work, and that commute was so hard on me because of the sitting. I took the train in just so I could stand on the train. But the quality of my life was so diminished, and work would take so much out of me that it was going to work, going home, going to work, going home, trying to recover through the weekend. Like, my world was just incredibly small, and I didn't want to be a burden on other people. So I never shared how much I was struggling and how difficult things were for me. Even with my husband, we lived in the same house like all the time now because I wasn't going to the station anymore. And I had no idea how to communicate to him what I was experiencing. And for him, he had no idea how to fix it. He knew something was really wrong because I just was not myself, and I didn't look like myself. And he didn't know how to fix it, so he was silent too. So we just existed in this world kind of silence. I'm sure we talked about stuff, probably our dog at the time. Like, that was probably our one, he was probably the thing that saved our marriage, was our dog Buster at the time. And no one, like, there was no acknowledgement during all of this time of how freaking difficult all of that is and how distressing it would be for your world and your career and your identity to be upended. And I had no recognition of how much those things would be affecting my experience and in my way of being in the world, down to my cells, at a biological level, at a physiological level. When we're constantly ramped up and in those, like, that protective state, that wind up or ramping up of our systems makes everything seem like it's a threat and that it needs more protection. We're going to have more pain. But so 2 years after surgery, so 3 years into my experience, 3 years to the day of the twinge, I medically retired from the fire department, and did so kind of at the, I don't want to say the encouragement of my surgeon, but my surgeon was wonderful. My surgeon was absolutely fantastic. Always made me feel listened to, believed. Never once made me feel like my pain was my fault or I was some weak or failure of a person for not getting better. And he pretty much said, like, you need to find your own path forward. You need to get out of the workers' compensation system if you're going to get better. It's like, your pain is very real. There's nothing I, as a surgeon, can do about it anymore because it's not a surgical problem. And that kind of makes it seem like he was abandoning me, but I didn't feel like that at all and felt empowered to find a different path forward. So I went back to graduate school again and went into a human movement program because I still had very biomechanical notions of pain. If I just fix my movement more, fix my posture more, then I'll be out of pain. And I chose pain science as my research focus. And that was what just totally changed my understanding of pain and understanding it to be a whole person problem, not just a joint problem or a tissue-based problem. And that, as overwhelming as it is to learn that, like, all of our systems are involved in the experience of pain, you know, our nervous system, our immune system, our endocrine system, because they're involved in all aspects of our human experience in general. It also gave me different ways of changing my experience, you know, of trying to do things. Greg Lehman calls it calming shit down, to calm my systems down that had been so overprotective of me for so long, because I had been in pain at that point for years. And it just gave me a different way of moving forward, where I became more kind of self-compassionate, and which was the hardest thing for me, you know, because I was so hard on myself all the time. Being an athlete, I think it's part of the way that I was an athlete. I was hard on myself so that I would get better, you know. As a firefighter, I was hard on myself so that I would get better. And I took that mentality into my pain experience too. So it was about becoming a little bit kinder and gentler to myself.
Do you mind if I ask you a question about that?
No, please do. I'm sure people are sick of listening to me ramble on right now.
I mean, it's fascinating to me, and I can relate on like so many different levels. And I mean, but there's so much here. But when you were started getting out of pain, so it's almost as if you went from paradise to hell.
Yeah.
And you probably had a glimpse that you were living in your paradise because you were doing exactly what you wanted to do, which a lot of people aren't that, you know, don't even get there. But
Right.
you knew you were doing what you were created to do. And then you just ended up in this hell. I mean, that's really what it was. What you said, you talked about, you learned how to become self-compassionate. Did your pain start lessening before that or after that?
Much after that. So when I started to understand pain differently and started approaching, so what that helped me to do, I actually got to interview Lorimer Mosley, who's a neuroscientist in the pain world. I got to interview him when I was in graduate school. I grilled him about pain science for most of our conversation. We had a lovely conversation. At the end, I asked him what the one thing he would want people in pain to know or to do. And he gave me a sciencey answer first, but then he said, my real answer is to love and be loved. And it was a mind-blowing statement for me. And it sounds like hyperbole to say that it changed the course of my life, but it did, because I realized how much I didn't love myself at that time, how I didn't feel very lovable. And in those things also probably wasn't very loving towards other people too. I mean, I had shut people out and withdrawn from people and just closed people out of my existence. And just by virtue of him having this 45-minute, hour-long conversation with me, just by nature of that conversation, he showed me that I was a person of worth because I was worth listening to and having this conversation with. He made me question some of those doubts and negative beliefs I had formed about myself, and helped me to see that maybe going forward and engaging with the people that I love, with the experiences that I love, and the places that I love, maybe that is my way forward rather than trying to fix the pain first. Because for so long I thought I have to fix this pain before I can get back to my life and back to being me. And that made me think maybe I can get back to life and living and being me with pain. So I kind of thought of it as making space for pain so I could make room for all of those things that mattered to me, that gave meaning to my life and gave me a sense of purpose.
That's beautiful. Like, I've got all these thoughts, so I was wondering, if were you trying to fix the pain or were you attacking the pain? And if you're attacking it, like, that, because judgment can cause hurt and pain,
Yeah.
but acceptance and love can cause healing. And so it's just, when you're saying all these things, I'm like, it's just neat to see how it unfolded for you as well.
Yeah. And it's both those, like, especially at first I tried to fix it, and then it became the enemy. It became something I was fighting and battling. And then when you think about that, so my hip, I called it my stupid hip. My stupid hip was this enemy, or it was the traitor that had let this enemy pain in, that took everything from me. It took my career. It took my identity. It took my financial security. It took my future from me. It took my friends and my family, like that. And it wasn't like I was saying those things out loud, but that became a part of this story that I was living. This enemy pain came inside my traitor of a hip and destroyed my life. So when we think about pain that way, or at least for me, this is end of one experience, then, like, I hated a part of me. I hated a part of my body. And it led to some really interesting things in retrospect. This is all just theoretical because there's no way of proving it. But I started having really weird sensory things with my leg where it didn't feel, this is going to sound crazy. It didn't feel like my leg was mine. I knew that it was mine. I knew that it was attached to me. I knew that it belonged to me, but it did not feel like mine. And I had lost, other than the pain in my hip and in my groin, sensory perception in my leg. Like, I wouldn't know if my foot was making contact with the ground for sure unless I looked to make sure my foot was making contact with the ground. And all of this was a bonkers thing for me, and it made me feel crazy. And no one ever told me this was a thing. And it was only in finding a book by Oliver Sacks called A Leg to Stand On, where he had a very similar experience, where he had essentially disowned his leg after a traumatic fall where he broke his leg. That I was like, okay, if Oliver Sacks experienced this, I'm allowed to too. Like learning that other people have had a similar experience. And he wrote a whole book about it, and he's a pretty smart guy. Made it okay for that to have happened to me too. But part of my process of reintegrating my leg into my sense of who I was, I guess, was not being so hateful of it and not considering it the enemy. And for me, I did a lot of, like, to facilitate that. I thought more of like the homunculus in my brain, like the virtual representation of my hip in my brain, rather than my hip directly, because I wasn't angry with my brain. I was angry with my hip. So if I went there, it was safer. And so kind of started doing some imagery stuff and started working that. It's funny because I'm going to call it a guy when I'm a girl, but that guy out instead of my hip. But I mean, in all of this, I know, like you keep saying, there's so much here. There's so much here. And it's what makes me so fascinated about pain now, and why I think it's so important that we don't have simplistic explanations for pain, because that that always puts the blame on the person in pain when they don't get better. When the simple explanation for pain and the fix for that doesn't work, then the blame is on the person in pain rather than on pain is friggin' complex. Humans are complex. And the way forward is probably not going to be very simple the longer that someone is in pain. But even with acute pain, context matters. The environment matters. Our beliefs matter. All of those things too. Like with athletes, it's really important for them to stay connected with their team when they're in pain. Because if they're separated from their team, that can lead to difficulties in recovery and rehabilitation because their identity then is on the line. Their fears for their future of their sports career, whether it's professional or collegiate or recreational, are on the line. And so I think taking this more nuanced perspective of what pain is can be really helpful for all people who interact with people in pain. And so many people do, even if that's not their job. Fitness trainers are doing it all the time, even if it's not their job, that they're not seeing someone specifically for pain. They might be seeing people with pain,
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
And then we all have friends and family that are experiencing pain too. And I think just having a different understanding of what pain is can help us to be more compassionate for others and for ourselves as well. I think that that's equally as important. And I think for the people who are specifically working with people in pain, it takes some of the burden and weight off of them. They cannot be expected to fix it. It can't be something that they fix. They can facilitate recovery. They can facilitate rehabilitation, but they shouldn't be expected to just fix it. And those broader narratives that we have in society, that pain is something that is readily identified on some sort of scan or x-ray and then can be fixed by some sort of pill or surgery, we need to start changing. And I think that the better understanding we have of pain generally, the more those narratives can start to change and the more effective what we do about pain can be moving forward.
So I've taken some notes. If you're out there and you are experiencing chronic pain, if there were some take-home notes from this conversation with Jo, one would be there's hope. You can recover. You can see the sun come back out again. You're not doomed. Two would be pain does not mean that there's damage. That alone can free you. That can set you free. I actually heard a friend say that out loud one day, and it literally was like I heard angels strumming harps when he said it, because that was at that moment and that time, that was the one thing I needed to hear. Pain does not mean damage, and it just gave me such a paradigm shift, and it was like I could take a boulder that was on my shoulder and set it down. That's the weirdest way to explain it. And three would be have self-compassion. You got to love yourself. And it's going to be really hard to love others if you don't have it in you to love yourself, because you just can't give away what you don't have. Jo, thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
You're welcome. Thanks so much for having me.
So if someone wants to learn, say someone's dealing with chronic pain, what are some good resources that they could have where they could find help?
Yeah, so I do have a nonprofit called Endless Possibilities Initiative, and our website is epicolorado.org, and there's a resource page there for anything that I miss here.
Okay.
And there are great resources out there. TameTheBeast.org is one of my favorites for people living with pain. Live Well with Pain is a UK organization but has wonderful resources and information on there. Pain BC is based in Canada, also fantastic free resources for people living with pain. Those are probably
what about My Cup of Jo? Would that be?
Oh, yeah. my blog is mycupofjo.com, and people can also reach out to me there through the contact form. It comes straight to my email. And there's the more recent posts are probably geared more towards clinicians, and the earlier posts probably geared more towards people living with pain. But there's search function that people can look for
Awesome.
things there.
So I will put all these resources in the notes of the podcast, guys. And so again, if you're listening to this, you may not be in chronic pain, and hopefully you never will be. But you might know somebody that is. Please share this this episode with a friend that might be hurting, or just send them to mycupofjo.com and turn them on to Jo. All right, guys, thanks so much for listening to this week's edition of the Original Strength Podcast. Jo, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.